back to the Bat, Fox, and Flux Tavern. It is episode 9, and we are discussing equipment. Woo!
Yay.
Equipment's kind of mundane, but it's important. You're nothing without your equipment, in more ways than one sometimes. To start off equipment, just going to quickly explain. Money in D&D and 3.5 works on a 3-coin system. You have your coppers, your silvers, your golds. If you're lucky, you'll see a platinum, but you don't see platinums very often. And frankly, I feel adding platinum just over convolutes an otherwise simple thing where 10 copper equals 1 silver, 10 silver equals 1 gold. And I think at 3.5,
It's all base 10.
if this was 4th edition, it's a little better because I think it's 100 platinum to a gold. So having platinum does actually make a nice sizable dent in the size of your coin purse. And 3.5, really the difference between having 50 copper and 5 platinum pieces is not that much. Frankly, most people, if you hand them a platinum piece, they're going to have no idea what the fuck to do with it. You're like, how the fuck am I going to make change for this? Just give me fucking gold and silver.
Actually, in daily life in D&D, your usual unit of monetary value is going to be in copper.
Yeah, most peasants are paid in coppers, and they usually see yearly salary is measured in silver pieces in D&D usually, unless you're an adventurer, in which case you see gold and platinum pieces more often. To give you an example, if you want a pound of wheat, that's a copper. You want a pound of flour or chicken, that's a copper. It's a silver for a pound of iron. A pound of fucking iron in a medieval setting is a valuable commodity, and that's 1 silver. That kind of gives you an idea of sort of the trade good values of the D&D world.
Although for some reason, 1 pig is 3 gold.
Apparently a pig is so much more valuable than a fucking chicken that the price jumps from 2 coppers to 3 gold. Oh god, I can't even begin to think about the percentage that's above a 200%, probably above 300% increase in value between a chicken and a pig. Not entirely sure what the economics of that are, other than fucked up. Next, we get into weapons, since there's really nothing more to say about wealth without getting into starting wealth and stuff. And all you really know about starting wealth is every class has different starting wealth based on the perceived affluence of a given type of class.
Yeah.
For example, fighters tend to get the most, I believe, next to paladins and rangers, which tie for them, because fighters are perceived as a very wealthy individual who's a sword for hire, who sees plenty of work. Rangers often see plenty of work as guides, so they get a lot of gold. And paladins, obviously, a paladin, basically a full knight, so he gets a lot of gold. And then it goes down from there. Monks get a lot for some bizarre reason. Really don't know why. They get as much as clerics.
No, monks get the least.
On my random starting gold, it says monks get 5d4. Oh, not 5, just 5d4. Okay. Usually it's times 10, and it's just 5d4. Okay, never mind. Monks at the least. That makes sense. I was about to go call Wizard and complain about my 10, 15-year-old book and claim that they mistyped in my book. I was upset. They got confused the hell out of support customer service guy at fucking Wizards of the Coast. It's a 3.5 manual you're calling about, sir? Damn right it is! Not 3.5 manual I've had for 15 years as a typo I only just now found. So weapons, you got your weapon categories, you got your weapon ranges, and I guess you could say the weapon type is if it's light one-handed or two-handed. So your breakdown weapon categories are simple weapons, which almost everybody knows how to use, most if not all simple weapons by default. Simple weapons are incredibly simple things like clubs, a knife, anything that any idiot can pick up and figure out how the hell it works. Martial weapons are usually weapons that require some degree of training to be competent at. You can usually use a martial weapon pretty simple. I mean, a longsword's not that hard to figure out, but it takes a degree of training with a longsword to be an actual swordsman. And then you have exotic weapons, which are very rare exotic weapons. Usually they're very unusual, or they're from faraway lands, or they're very specific to a race. And they require more specialized training and more specialized handling to use. And thus, usually you almost always need a feat to use one. I don't believe there's any classes that start out with more than maybe 1 or 2 exotic weapons. And even then, I don't think any classes do. I think it's just races that sometimes get an exotic weapon. I believe dwarves get 2 dwarven exotic weapons. One's like a double-sided axe. That's a dual weapon. And then the other one's, one end is an axe and the other one's a pike kind of a thing. And then you have your melee weapons and your ranged weapons. Self-explanatory. And your light one-handed, two-handed. And really the only difference between light, one-handed is a light weapon is usually you could use your dexterity with it. It's light enough to allow a degree of finesse that a weapon that you just hold in one hand doesn't necessarily give you. A light weapon just means it's a very small, very nimbly wielded weapon. One-handed just denotes that it's a weapon you hold easily in one hand. And then obviously two-handed weapon is you have to use two hands because it's a big honking thing like a greatsword. Weapons come in various sizes, just like characters do. Sizes will always determine what handedness the weapon has. If a weapon's bigger than you, it's either going to be two-handed or just way too big to use. If it's smaller than you, generally, it's going to be one-handed or light. And if it's the same size, usually it's either one or two-handed, depending on the weapon. And then you have improvised weapons. There are rules for just picking up and using random shit as weapons. It's based purely on the size of the weapon, so I always encourage GM's discretion whether an improvised weapon works as an actual weapon, because otherwise a feather does the same damage as a rock, which it doesn't. It's a feather. Why does chucking a feather have the same damage as a rock? It technically doesn't. So, again, DM's discretion on whether or not you allow a certain item to be used as an actual weapon or not. And whether or not you decide a weapon does more or less damage even than what the table says, because sometimes, again, a rock and a bottle. One's going to do a little bit more damage than the other. If it's a big honking fucking rock, but it's still technically, say, a tiny weapon, and you have a bottle, which is also technically a tiny weapon. The bottle's not going to do as much damage as bludgeoning someone in the face with that rock. So, again, DM's discretion, always when you're dealing with improvised weapons. Really, there's not much else really to go into weapons without getting into actual mechanics. And as always, we try to avoid mechanics here. This is mostly just about simplified character creation and helping you make your characters and stuff.
Can I say something about weapons? Double weapons are stupid.
I would like to play devil's advocate in a very specialized sense. Double weapons are stupid unless you have the option to use them as a single weapon, and each end of the weapon is technically a different weapon.
Yeah, but a quarterstaff is a double weapon, and trying to use it as such doesn't really work.
Just hit somebody with one side of the quarterstaff and call it a day. You'll get more attacks and you'll hit way more things than if you try to hit people with both sides of the quarterstaff. Unless you're a monk. A monk with a quarterstaff can be amazing because they technically get to use the quarterstaff and their unarmed attacks freely without any penalty.
Should probably explain what they are.
Well, that's a good segue because that's exactly what we're getting into next. I'm not going to go line item on weapons. There's too many weapons to do that if we're going to do that with every weapon, every armor, every item. But suffice to say, there's a lot of weapons, quarterstaff being one of them. If you want to know what a quarterstaff is, it's a staff. It's a long piece of wood that you whack somebody in the face with.
As a matter of fact, there is no price for a quarterstaff. It's just a fucking stick.
Yeah, actually, you're right. Same thing with the club. Club is just a fucking stick. If you want a club, just pick up a stick and hit somebody with it. If it's not long enough to be a quarterstaff, it's a club. Same thing with slings. A sling is just anything you can put a rock in, spin around, and launch a rock out of. There is no price for that. It could be anything from a strip of leather to a piece of paper that you use once, if you really wanted to. So sling also has no price.
The bullets for a sling, however, do have a price, but those are well-crafted sling bullets. They're aerodynamic, and if you don't use them, you're going to incur penalties for
using a rock. The rules basically stipulate if you don't have bullets for a sling, you can just pick up rocks and use rocks and pebbles. And there's a penalty for that, but it's just as valid as using the bullets if you want to save money in a pinch situation.
You should always be carrying daggers.
Yeah, always have at least 2 daggers. 3 if your main weapon's a dagger, because you want your utility dagger, your backup dagger, and your main dagger. If you don't use daggers, then you want your utility dagger and your backup dagger. What's the backup dagger, you ask? It's the dagger you keep on you in case you lose your weapon. What's the utility dagger? It's the dagger you use for things that don't involve combat. It's for cutting rope and messing about with traps and locks and things. Whatever you think you could use a dagger for as a large, sharp, pointy metal object, or not large, but small. Large in the sense of a small item, I suppose. Then take an extra knife. So I think what we should really get into when it comes to weapons is just, let's kind of go by class. Think of a class and think of the weapon you feel is the best weapon available to that class for the cost of a starting package budget. I'm going to throw one out, Paladin. If you're a Paladin, for whatever god-awful reason, what do you think should be the starting weapon for a Paladin out there?
Great sword.
Okay. Flux, thoughts?
It depends on your Paladin. Are you the tank Paladin or are you the damage dealing Paladin?
Exactly. That's why I decided to go Paladin first. Some classes, you can take many different builds. Paladin is the easiest one to do an example with because there's really 2 types of Paladin. As Flux pointed out, there's the tank Paladin and the damage Paladin. They're both ship Paladins, but for the purpose of illustrating multiple possibilities of equipment loadout, it's a good starting position. In fact, it's the one good thing we've said about Paladin all season, I think.
My god, we didn't shit-talk Paladin for a second?
For a second. I think that's only happened twice this entire show.
If you're an offensive Paladin, yeah, grab a great sword. If you are a defensive Paladin, you have 2 options. You can grab a shield and sword, any kind of type, or, and you can also supplement this with the shield and sword, grab a spear. Because a tank who can threaten with reach is a terrifying tank. No one's going to come close to your teammates.
To be specific, you need a long spear for that.
Yeah, long spear is what you want.
Long spear is the one that has the extra range, but there is a downside in 3.5 to extra range. For whatever bizarre reason that is unfathomable to me, they decided if your weapon could poke somebody 10 feet away, there's no way in hell you can hit somebody next to you. It's not like there's a whole side heft of a weapon you can use to just bludgeon them away.
Yeah, but the thing is, if you can't hit someone next to you, then that means the enemy's targeting you, and that means you're a good tank.
Using a normal spear works as well because you can throw it if you have multiple spears.
But you're paladin. Your ranged attack is shit.
No, but it does give you that extra bit of threat in the sense that just because they're not next to you doesn't mean they can ignore you. Because you have a couple extra spears there. Let's say you carry 4 or 5 spears on you. That means you have 3 or 4 range shots you can do at somebody who chose to ignore you. You're like, hey, bitch, you ignored me. Spear to the face. That gets their attention. That makes them want to come after you because the priority, to get a little bit into something that we will be talking about in either season 2 or 3, the priorities for monster attack is usually whoever did the damage to them last. If the paladin can hit somebody at range and get their attention at range, it means it's going to draw them in when they may have targeted somebody else instead of him. And then the spear, you can still use with a shield. So the tank paladin still has a bit of extra tank to him. As for why you would take a sword over one of the other weapons, quite simply, the damage in threat range. What is a threat range? That's the numbers you roll to get a critical hit. Normally, you have to roll a 20 on a d20 to get a critical hit. But if you have a longsword and a few other weapons, that range is different. The range for the longsword, and I believe also the greatsword, is 19 to 20. If you roll a 19 or a 20, that's a possible critical hit. You roll again, and if you still hit your target, then it does a critical hit. It also does 1d8 damage when wielded by a medium creature with a medium-sized longsword. So a longsword deals a decent amount of damage, plus you get the added benefit of being able to carry a shield in the offhand.
Or if you want to forego shield, greatsword just gives you 2d6.
If you're a tank cleric, because cleric also has 2 builds, like a paladin. A tank cleric, I actually usually prefer something like a mace or a morning star. It also does a lot of heavy damage, but unlike paladins or fighters, some of the other classes, clerics don't really need to rely on those critical hits to do their pinch damage because they have access to spells. You may be saying, whoa, doesn't paladin have spells? Well, see our giant rant on paladins and spells in previous episodes. I will not repeat that here for the sake of time.
I would.
Well, don't. We don't have the time. Bludgeoning weapons on a cleric fit very well because bludgeoning weapons generally do a high amount of straight damage, but without that critical threat range of slashing and piercing weapons tend to have. Slashing weapons, I think, have the extra threat, and then piercing weapons generally have the extra crit damage.
Plus, there's the fact that a cleric is known for going against the undead.
Undead hate bludgeoning.
Undead are really awesome against just ignoring slashing and piercing, but they suck against bludgeoning.
Another key thing about undead, even if they didn't, undead are dead. Critically striking their organs does nothing. So having no extra crit threat range or crit damage, not a bad thing. You're hitting something that can't be critically hit anyway. So might as well bring something that just is flat out straight heavy damage. If you're going to be a heavy war cleric, as I call them, take a 2-handed bludgeoning weapon. That's when you get to play with things like mauls and 2-handing your mace, and that's just a whole degree of fun that I believe we can only express through just telling you to go watch Gallagher smash watermelons. There's no other way to express the joy of being a cleric. You're just banging things over the head with a 2-handed bludgeoning weapon.
Sovek, I think most of the people listening might not even know who Gallagher is.
Well, you know what? I have something to say to that.
Is he like Mencia?
Stop being young. And to what Flux said, Mencia can go fuck himself. He's not funny. Dang kids these days, they're not knowing who funny people are. I bet none of you even know who Carrot Top is.
We don't want to know who Carrot Top is.
I like that fatty Arbuckle guy.
None of you know about the joys. I actually do enjoy Carrot Top, not gonna lie. Not gonna lie, I do enjoy Carrot Top's humor. Anyway, moving on. Certain weapons for certain jobs. If you're gonna be primarily ranged, bows are your best friend. Bows have great range, great damage. Bows also all have ×3 crit. Crossbows, if you're not going to be ranged, but you need a bit of extra ranged protection in the event that you run out of spells in the case of spellcaster, crossbows.
Or if you're a bard or rogue. They seem to be the kind that usually use crossbows.
I would say the bards and rogues should use the hand crossbow or the light crossbow, because they can be reloaded faster and used more often. A heavy crossbow on a spellcaster or even a heavy crossbow on a cleric as a backup weapon is not a bad idea. It takes a full turn, usually, to fully reload and ready a heavy crossbow for firing. So you're only going to attack every other turn, but it's every other turn doing something instead of sitting there sucking your thumb saying, I have no spells. Another good thing about the sheer variety of weapons is if you're a fighter. No two fighters will usually be the same if they're built with a specialization in mind. Because there's so many weapons, and as long as you pick a weapon and you stick to it, your fighter will be amazing with that weapon. There's tridents in here, there's flails, longswords, scimitars, falchions. You think of a weapon, it's either going to be in the main book or in a side book that focuses on martial classes like the fighter.
Except for a two-handed hammer, which is stupid. You can't make a dwarven paladin who carries around a giant hammer.
Yes, you can, because a warhammer can be used two-handed. And technically, a maul is a giant hammer.
Okay, maul works.
I believe one of the books added a maul. There is a side book that essentially adds a maul.
I had two-handed and a warhammer. That looks stupid.
Well, I always argue that you could just up the dice on a warhammer and call it a two-handed variant of a warhammer.
See, now that's the other part of equipment that's so fascinating is there are different sizes, and you can get off of the standard medium and get a large version of it. It costs a bit more, but then you can two-hand it, and then you can be happy.
And there'll be rules for the extra damage it does for being bigger. So there you go, just buy an upsized Warhammer, and I believe an upsized Warhammer from 1d8 does 2d6. Yeah, so your damage goes up, your minimum damage goes up even because you're rolling 2 dice. You're guaranteed at least 2 damage instead of 1. I will say this, a word of caution on any axes. Axes tend to be very high risk, high reward playstyle because axes generally have a giant dice that they roll, but they don't roll a lot of that giant dice. Prime example, Great Axe has the biggest dice that you can roll for damage, a 1d12, but that's a single dice. Single dice is always risky because you have the potential of doing 1 damage at any given roll. You have the potential of doing that 12 damage. When you do that 12 damage, it's amazing. And a Great Axe is great when it crits because it gets times 3 critical. But if you don't get that crit and you don't roll high on that damage dice, your axe isn't doing much. So I generally don't put axes on characters because of that. I prefer the reliability of a sword. Swords usually have a very reliable damage dice, or the guaranteed heavy hit of a mace type weapon, or a scythe. A scythe is a great weapon if you don't care about doing a ton of high-end damage, but you just want consistent mid-range damage. Scythe is a great weapon to pick. Scythe also does a times 4 critical. It's both piercing and slashing. You do have a bit of variety with your damage. I'm personally a big fan of scythe fighters, because you can also make trip attacks with the scythe because of the curve. And what a trip attack is, and if you're wondering, it's an attack you get to make with the intention of tripping your enemy.
You don't say.
Yeah, in case you couldn't put that together yourself, there you go. There's also a disarm attempt, where certain weapons, because of their shape or because they have a chain like a flail or a spike chain, and by the way, for spike chain, if you can afford the feats, nothing is more fun than a spike chain fighter who just denies everybody their weapons and trips them constantly. A disarm attempt lets you just basically use your weapon to pull away their weapon, and some weapons, because of the way they're shaped or because of their inclusion of some kind of a chain in their design, let you wrap the chain or yank away their weapon in some way, shape, or form. That's really all there is much to say on weapons. There's a very extensive description for every weapon, so certainly if you have more questions about a specific weapon or what weapons are available, consult your nearest player's handbook and just look in the equipment section. It's the very first part of the equipment section after they explain how the fuck gold works.
Actually, wait, can I make a change to my previous statement about paladins for weapons? I said get a greatsword, which is nice, but if you think you're going to be using that horse, get a lance. A lance on a horse is the most bullshit thing, because you get double damage from charging, you get double damage from a lance, so that's a total of, I think you double the previous double. You do a crap ton of damage with a lance while on horseback.
Oh, yeah, it's terrifying. I was going to actually get into that later on because horses are brought up later on in the section where they talk about mounts and things. If you're going to be in a campaign that uses horses a lot, and I believe we touched a little bit about this last week in feats when we discussed the different feats for horseback riding and horseback combat, lances and bows are the weapons of choice if you're going to do ranged or melee combat on a horse. It's very easy to reload a bow on a horse as opposed to a crossbow, because you don't exactly have the ground upon which to place your foot and pull back the winch. I guess you could go with a hand crossbow on a horse, but that'd just be wacky.
Also, if you're any kind of spellcaster and you don't have a dagger as your primary melee weapon, you're doing it wrong.
I will argue against that. There are other alternatives to a dagger, but not many. They get all light, simple weapons. Also, sorcerers can use a spear. And a spear does more damage than a dagger and does more crit. So personally, if I'm a sorcerer, I'm going to use a spear. If I'm a wizard, I'm going to have a crossbow and a dagger.
Or have a rapier because you're a bullshit elf.
Well, yeah, if you're an elf, you just get a rapier and be very bullshit with it.
Well, you should still have a dagger anyway.
Yeah, I did have a dagger on Thule, the elf in question, upon which Flux is called bullshit. You're only angry because that means I competed with you for magical rapiers.
Stupid.
Really, there's nothing much else to cover on weapons, really, without getting into the specifics of individual weapons. And for the sake of time, I really don't want to do that. That's not really what the show's about.
But don't you want to talk about the N-teenth monk weapon that was only created for monks and no one else gets? It's like 5 different weapons that only monks get. Stupid.
Nunchucks. Monks get nunchucks and no one else does for free.
Nunchucks, katars.
Size. Size, by the way, can I just say, completely useless. There's no conceivable reason to use either a sai or a nunchuck when your unarmed damage does more damage by default. Actually, no. Nunchuck is the same as your base unarmed. A sai does 1d4 damage. No monk in his right mind should be using anything that is less than 1d6 damage as his monk weapon. At that point, he'd just be punching things and it does more damage. Granted, that's the monk's whole thing, is he punches things that does more damage. Monks get special monk weapons. They also get shuriken as a thrown weapon. Shuriken's alright, I guess, because I believe in 3.5 they have the rules that you can throw 3 at once. And each one does exactly 1 damage is small, 1 to 2 damage for medium. You get to throw 3 1d2 damage things out there, which is a little better than most thrown weapons because that's a guaranteed 3 damage with a max potential of 6 damage. So it's actually surprisingly deadly to throw shurikens. But again, only monks really get to do that. So not really worth it unless you're a monk. If you see shuriken on that list, you're like, ooh, shuriken, I'm gonna be a ninja. Don't do it, really. Please, just don't. If you want to do that shit, be a monk. Otherwise,
Believe it, shurikens are useless.
believe it, shurikens are useless indeed. Let's just get on to armor before we sidetrack again. Getting into the basics of armor. Armors have what is known as an armor bonus. That's the bonus they're going to give to your armor stat by wearing them. Shields have a similar bonus called a shield bonus, but because of the way D&D works with your armor bonuses with the same name do not stack. Therefore, shield and armor, it is very important to note the distinction that one is an armor bonus and one is a shield bonus, because otherwise you could not have armor and a shield at the same time. There's also the concept of the maximum dexterity bonus. All armors and some shields have a maximum dexterity bonus. That means that because of the weight, the way the armor fits on you and everything else, you can only use your dexterity bonus up to that value, and factoring into how your defense works based on your nimbleness. Lighter armors allow for more dexterity and thus more dodging. Heavier armors do not, because they're heavy and you really can't be dodging around in plate mail. There's also the armor check penalty. Certain skills, I believe we did roughly touch upon this in skills, I hope we did. It's been so long now, I can't really remember. Certain heavier armors restrict things like swimming, climbing, because they're heavy. They're heavy or they're very cumbersome to move around in, so doing certain physical activities is more exhausting and more difficult, and because of that you take a penalty to those skill points. It'll usually denote within the skill itself whether or not you suffer an armor check penalty to do so. Lastly, other than speed, which really isn't all that important, arcane spell check failure. Arcane spell check failure is if you're wearing this type of armor, that is the percentage of which your spells will fail because your armor restricts your movements and everything else too much to really allow you to properly execute the spell and all the magical things required to do your spell. It starts at 5% for padded and it gets all the way up to, I think, 40% is the highest if you're wearing half plate.
And if you have a shield tower, it's 50% as well. So you can end up with a 90% spell failure chance. Now, a good way around that is to use Still Spell, and then you won't have to worry about that. But again, you're getting into meta magic feats of spell slotting up.
Does Still Spell really apply to that?
Yes.
I believe they did this, and I'm getting into a book I shouldn't. In one of the arcane books, I believe they mentioned that unless you have a specific feat or specific class that negates armor check penalty, even with Still Spell, armor check penalty will always apply because armor in and of itself disrupts magic. Unless you're trained specially to ignore the weight of the armor distracting you from the performing of your spell.
That wasn't in the core, but yeah.
One of the supplemental books pretty much just said, no, Still Spell will not do this. That is bullshit and cheap, and that is a very cheap way of ignoring it. You need a special feat that lets you ignore a certain class of armor. For example, I believe the feat is, if your class lets you ignore a certain weight value of armor, either light, medium, or heavy, then you get to ignore one higher than the highest that your class ignores at the time you take the feat.
Yeah, in the core books, they never address this, so you could actually use Still Spell to get around Arcane Failure.
I would argue, though, that was DM's discretion.
It's mainly DM's discretion, because in the supplements they decided to say, remember when we didn't cover this topic? Yeah, we're covering this topic now, and fuck you, that's a loophole we're closing.
Yeah, otherwise, just having 1 feat meant that a full plate wizard with a tower shield was valid. And let's face it, a full plate wizard with a tower shield, while that sounds awesome, should be something that's very specialized and requires its own build to do. Why they added a class for that. It's called the Battle Mage. Its whole purpose is to be able to ignore up to medium armor and then get that feat that it helps you ignore more so you can wear heavy armor and still cast magic. The trade-off being he really only casts combat-oriented magic at a much smaller degree than even a sorcerer does. But again, specialized build. He gets to wade into melee while still throwing magic around. That's really all you need to know about armor, other than the heavier armors will make you only move 20 feet if your move speed's 30 feet, and it'll only make you move 15 feet if your move speed is normally 20 feet. Other than that, there's really not much else to talk about. You have your light armors, which are leather padded armors, just wearing a chain shirt with really nothing else. Your medium armors, which are hide armors made of hides from animals, scale mail, chain mail, a breastplate. You got your heavy armors like full plate, like I mentioned, half plate. Banded mail. I've never really understood what banded mail is supposed to be. I've seen it in so many things, but I don't really understand the concept of banded mail. Then you also have your splint mail. Shields. Bucklers are worth noting. Buckler is a little different than other shields. Buckler does not use up your hand. Other shields do. Other shields are heavy to the point where you have to have like a handle inside the shield that you're always holding on to help keep the shield there. It's helping to hold up the shield and keep the shield from flopping about and off balancing you. A buckler is usually a small, light wooden shield that straps to either your forearm or your bicep. And you can use that to block with basically turning yourself to the side while still being able to hold a weapon in that hand. So a buckler allows for using two-handed weapons and dual wielding, I believe. The purpose of the buckler is so if you're a heavy weapon user with giant weapons, you can strap a buckler to your arm and still have some defense. It's only +1, but that +1's still better than nothing. But then, of course, Tower Shield. Tower Shield gets its own special rules, because let's face it, Tower Shield's bullshit. A Tower Shield, for those who don't know their armors very well, is a shield that's as big, if not bigger than you are. It is designed to basically be plopped down in front of you. You stand there holding it up, and then you poke things from around the side of it. If something tries to hit you, you just stand behind it, and then by sheer blessing of its size, it will deflect the blow. It gives you total concealment when you're fully behind it. Because what you basically do is, with the tower shields, you have 2 modes. There's holding it mode, and then there's plopping it down mode. Holding it mode is just a +4 armor bonus. Plopping it down mode, you give up the +4 armor bonus, but you gain a level of cover, depending on how well hidden behind the shield you are based on your size and where on the shield you are. To put it in a way that you can visualize in your face, think of the shields that the Roman Legion used. That's a tower shield. If you got a bunch of people marching at you with tower shields and they put those shields down and crouch underneath them, you're not hitting them with anything from afar. They're just going to hide behind that and ignore your arrows. And thankfully, that's really all there is to say on armor.
Actually, there's extras.
Oh, right. Armor spikes. I forgot about those.
You have armor spikes, which you can add to your armor. Shield spikes, which you can add to your shield. And then there's the locked gauntlet. And the locked gauntlet is amazing and horrible at the same time. It has, instead of a arcane spell failure chance, you can't cast spells at all if you have a locked gauntlet, because your hand is not free to cast the spell.
Your hand is locked to your weapon with chains. Therefore, you can never drop your weapon. It's great if you're somebody who never gives up his weapon, but if you're somebody like a fighter who generally has 2 weapons, it's both a blessing and a curse, because you can't in any quick way switch between, say, your sword and your bow. If you have a bow, or your sword, your crossbow, your sword, or whatever you carry with you for your ranged weapon.
And the whole point of spikes is just to add melee damage to your shield and your armor. It doesn't add any bonuses, it just adds damage.
Shield spikes are for when you do shield bash. I think it does like 1 point of extra damage every time you shield bash somebody. And then armor spikes are designed if you grapple somebody, grappling being a thing in 3.5 and 4E and many other editions. If you wrestle a guy down, because your armor's covered in spikes, it's doing extra damage, because as you're wrestling him down, you're poking him all over with tiny sharp metal pinpricks, basically. Goods and services. Goods and services, in a nutshell, are any non-armor, non-weapon goods that are just available to people on the basic common market. These are the things you go to the marketplace or you go to the general store and you start buying in order to supplement your adventure. Examples, a backpack. Backpack is something every adventurer must have. Backpack lets you carry things in a pack on your back. Yeah, we all know what a backpack is, but people don't realize that in the rules, you're not just allowed to carry things in your pants like your Solid Snake. You have to stash everything you're carrying somewhere. You can't just have this magical invisible inventory that you stick things in like a video game. D&D actually takes into consideration that stuff needs to be put into carrying device.
It's funny you mention that, though, because every other container for everything else in D&D has a weight limit for how much can be put into each item. Backpack, for some reason, has no weight limit. And it confounds people because players will take advantage of this and put 500 pounds of crap in a backpack.
Specifically 500 pounds of firewood.
And the DM just looks at this, goes, why? And the player will go, well, it doesn't say I can't.
And that's how I had the game I was in with somebody. We were stuck in a cave in the middle of a multi-day blizzard that lasted a week, and only at the end of the week, when we were starved to death, and she was a druid, by the way, and contemplating eating her animal companion for nutrition and using its fur for warmth, did she remember, oh, I have 500 pounds of firewood in my backpack? Which then prompted a unanimous table-wide, why do you have 500 pounds of firewood in your backpack? How the fuck are you carrying that? And why are you only just now remembering it? Backpacks don't have a listed limit on how much they can carry, unlike everything else in the game, except maybe sacks. Wait, Red Fox, they don't list it for sacks either, which is great because sacks are usually what you take for your treasure. So as long as you have 2 or 3 sacks, you can pretty much carry as much treasure as you frickin' want because there's no rules on how big a sack is.
As long as you can lift it up.
Yeah. In other editions, they may put a ruling on it, but 3.5 is full of beautiful, beautiful loopholes. And as the player, and even as a DM, I love loopholes in games.
Which is why the DM's discretion is always trumped what the book says, because these holes can get massive.
So really, because there's far too many items, then there needs to be to go over. Unless you want us to explain to you what an ink and ink pen are, or a jug made of clay, I'm going to just kind of briefly go over my top buys. The things that by the end of a campaign, or at least by the end of the first 2 adventures, you need to have at least one of each of these on somebody in the party. You need your backpack. Everyone needs their backpack. Everyone needs at least 1 bedroll, preferably 2 or 3. Because you never know when you need to just abandon camp and leave your bedrolls behind. If one bedroll gets wet because it starts raining and you didn't prepare for rain, you got that spare bedroll in your backpack that's still dry. So when you waterproof your camp, you can go back to sleep and not have to worry about drying out your bedroll. Winter blankets, because you never know when the DM is going to be a dick and teleport you to a far frozen wasteland and not give you any time to prep for winter climates. People don't understand that some tools are very useful. A crowbar. Don't have a rogue with you because he just died and there's a big hunkin' treasure chest right there with a lock? Oh no, what do we do? Well, we have to go revive the rogue. Well, no you don't. You get that crowbar, you give it to the fighter, and you have him fucking manhandle that baby open. Lock too tough? Hammer. Hammer that lock off first, then crowbar it. 10-foot poles. 10-foot poles are amazing. They let you touch things 10 foot in front of you. Like floor tiles in dungeons that may set off a trap 20 feet in front of you, thus sparing you from the trap and setting the trap off.
You're never going to let me live that down, are you?
The beauty of that time I was in your campaign, I just checked everything with 10-foot poles, and then used the hand of the mage to set off doors from a distance. No, I'm never going to let you live that down. 10-foot poles, never underestimate the power of being able to poke things 10 feet in front of you. That is 10 feet of safety that you can use to experiment with things that you think maybe have a trap or something on it. Or even if you want to poke some weird substance, you don't know what that substance is going to do, poke it with a 10-foot pole. Don't go sticking your finger in it first. For all you know, it's going to eat your finger. Flint and steel, because the DM may be a dick and just decide that everything around you is wet and not good for kindling without flint and steel. Empty flasks, because again, there may be some weird thing on the ground that you want to put in a flask and take back to give some fancy wizard for study. 10-foot ladders. Somebody should always have a 10-foot ladder somewhere in the party, because pits happen. And if someone falls in that pit, what's easier to get out of the pit with? Rope or a 10-foot ladder? Chalk. Chalk is amazing. There's never any one thing you can tell somebody on why do they need chalk, because chalk is just versatile. You're in a maze. Use chalk to mark where you've been. You need to make a note that something's a trap. Put chalk on it and draw a little chalk symbol near or on the trap if it's safe enough to draw on it. You can mark things. You can do whatever the frick you want with chalk. Chalk is amazing. Always have a couple pieces of chalk. Lanterns and torches. You want lots of torches because torches can be very easily dropped and forgotten about and not given a shit about because torches are cheap and you can buy them by the dozens and not really feel a dent in your wallet. and you just use torches to light a room. And when you don't need a torch to light a room, have a lantern, because a lantern is many, many, many hours of renewable, continuous light. And make sure you got plenty of oil. Grappling hooks are great. Put a grappling hook on something and do what a grappling hook does. Self-explanatory. Always have at least 50 to 100 feet of rope. If you can afford it, get silk rope. It gives you a bonus to climb and other various rope checks. Belt pouches. Never underestimate the power of having extra pouches on your belt, because you never know when you need something that you can access easier than your backpack, like potions. Potions and belt pouches are amazing. A portable ram, so you can bust doors open that are locked and can't get through because the lock's busted. Trail rations. If for any reason at any given time you have less than 10 trail rations and you are in a position to go buy more trail rations, buy more trail rations until you have 10 trail rations. By obeying this rule, you will never run out of trail rations in a pinch. Also, make sure you always have a water skin, because water doesn't just magically appear in your inventory. You need something to carry that water in, and so you get a water skin. Mirrors are like chalk. There's really no one thing I can say that you need to bring a mirror for, because it's absolutely going to happen. But you would be surprised how many times a mirror comes in handy for looking around corners if you're trying to be sneaky, or heaven forbid someone shoots a ray attack at you and you happen to have a mirror on you and you're smart enough to prepare ahead of time to deflect the ray attack with a mirror. I have had DMs argue that that works, and there's nothing funnier than watching a beholder try and hit you with one of his rays and then you just bounce it back at him. Sacks, always spare sacks because of loot, like I said, and bring a shovel or a pickaxe in case you need to dig.
Never underestimate the power of a fucking shovel. No one wants to bring a shovel. I always bring a shovel. And everyone looks at me funny. It's like, why'd you bring a shovel? Halfway through the campaign, oh my god, I'm so glad you brought a shovel.
We could dig through this thing that we needed to dig about. And after all that, if you have gold left over, grab a couple tents so you can not have to sleep under the stars all the time. Those are the various common items from the goods and services section that you need. From the special substances and items section, I don't find too much use for much of that, except an everborn
Turch.
Get your turch.
an everborn. Damn it, Flux! You've got me fucking up everything I say.
Quick, mate, get your turch.
The ever-burning torch, holy water, and occasionally sun rods and thunderstones. Usually not. As long as you get the torch and the holy water, that's pretty much the only thing you need from that section of the book. Everything else, it's fun to play around with once or twice, but there's no real definitive advantage to actually having them. Thankfully, tools and kits is something you only need to look at usually if you have a craft skill. If you're a divine spellcaster of any sort, you require a holy symbol because a holy symbol is covered under there. If you're a spellcaster, it needs a spell book because that's covered under there, or spellcaster in general because that's also where your spell components are. Or if you require something specialized for a skill.
Like thieves' tools.
Thieves' tools, yeah. If you're a rogue, get thieves' tools. Get disguise kit if you need to have a little extra thing to disguising. Climber's kit if you intend to do a lot of climbing and you have the climbing skill. Climber's kit is great because it lets you basically blaze the trail up the side of whatever you're climbing and make it easier for other people to climb up behind you. Things like that are really the only things you get from there that have any use. And I guess if you really want to know what time it is, you can get an hourglass, and you could bring some sort of apparatus so that the hourglass is always going while you're walking. I know a guy who did that once. He made a wooden backpack, and he put an hourglass suspended above it on a rotating pole, basically, so that he could just spin it every hour on his backpack to always keep track of what time it was. I don't know why he did it. It never came into play for anything. It was just some weird thing his character did. Tools and skill kits, that's really all you need from there. Clothing is kind of meh.
There's a special note about clothing. When you are creating your character, you get one free item of clothing from the clothing list.
And really, clothing after that point never really comes up unless it's very specific to a situation. Like, if you really need to upgrade your wardrobe to something fancier because you've moved up in the world, then you might want to consider getting fancier clothing. But for the most part, whatever clothing you pick at the start of the game is going to be the clothing you wear. There's no rules, whatever, on any of the clothing in the clothing section. Is that maybe Traveler's outfit? But I don't even think that does anything, does it?
I know cold weather outfit does because you'll need that for the cold weather.
Cold weather outfit does, but no one ever starts with a cold weather outfit unless they're from a cold weather area. That brings us to food, drink, and lodging. Really, that's more for the DM. It just lets you know how much the average cost of meals and rooms at inns go for.
Which all change depending on where you are in your game setting.
If the cost of inns and things never change ever in your game setting, then you're just lazy. There's nothing wrong with that approach, but I always feel a little bit of fluctuation, like a 1 unit higher or lower, depending on the wealth of a particular settlement, just to add that little bit of extra life to your world. And then there's mounts and related gear. I'm saving horse for last because it's very easy to lose your horses, especially in games where divine intervention is very common. Because for some reason, gods seem to forget that you had a horse, and they always seem to leave the horses behind right after you buy them and give them bottomless saddlebags that you can use for everything. Yes, Red Fox, that's aimed at you. I wanted my horse back so badly, you son of a bitch. So much so that in a time skip, I actually made part of my journey in that time skip hunting down and finding my horse again, which is why I had the horse back at the end of the time skip. If your campaign involves a lot of going through open land, feel free to get a horse. If you're going to be sticking to roads a lot and you don't really want to get a horse, then get a donkey or a mule. And you can use them to carry a lot of gear that you don't really need to have on your person, such as your shovels. There's different types of saddles. If you are going to get a horse, I definitely recommend saddlebags for extra bit of gear carry capacity. And really, there's not much else other than that usually, on average, 5 silver to stable your horses and various beasts of burden for a day. There's costs for different types of transports. If you want to buy a carriage, there's how much it's worth. A cart is worth so much, a galley, if you want to buy a galley. Keelboats, long ships, rowboats, sailing ships, etc.
Screw that. I want to buy a warship for 25,000 gold.
You say that. I had a party who did that once. If you recall from some previous episodes, I mentioned the group I had that went pirate. Their goal after they went pirate was they all got pardons and used their pirating money to buy a warship. And then they got privateer contracts for the villain to go crush ships from all the free nations. They were evil, evil group of dicks. And then there's rules for hiring different types of spellcasting services and miscellaneous services like messengers, tolls, coach cabs, things like that. And really, that's equipment. So really, that's all you really need to know about equipment. So I hope you all enjoyed. From myself, Flux and Red Fox, this has been the 9th episode, second to last episode. You'll find out more about that next time of the Bat, Fox, and Flux Tavern if you want to catch us elsewhere. There's my stream at twitch.tv/SovekOnivris. I will be streaming more often between seasons since I don't have to worry about recording these, because frankly, recording these is what's kept me off my stream for a while. Red Fox, weeknights at twitch.tv/redfox_nightfox. Flux whenever he feels like it. I don't think it's been much for a while. Twitch.tv/Fluxin. You can support me in the show at patreon.com/SovekOnivris. And I hope you all enjoyed and have a good time.